Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, Anthony, real pleasure of mine. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So can you introduce yourself to the people who aren't familiar?
Sure. My name is Mike Basila. B as in boy, A, S as in Sam, L-A. I go by Coach. I'm a native of this area. I was telling Anthony a little bit ago that his studio is very close to my neck of the woods. I grew up in Lincourt.
Okay.
If you know Court and Teal, in that general area. I went to St. Daniel's Grammar School. I went to Bishop Grimes High School. I was in the first graduating class there. Went down to University of South Florida. Thought I wanted to be an oceanographer, but I had a girlfriend up here. So I came back after the first semester, did some classes at OCC, went to work for Onondaga Beverage, got in the beer drivers union.
Wow.
They wanted to keep me. And I said, no, man, this is tough life. I can't do something else. So I went on to University at Albany, played football for them, got a math degree. Coach Ford, who was the head coach there for very many years, mentor of mine. And we all have people in our lives that help us move to the next level. He helped me get a teaching and coaching job down in Goshen, New York. Okay. I taught high school math down there. Did that for 3.5 years. But unfortunately, I love doing that and I love coaching. But what happened is, doggone it, we continue to have children, and I was having a hard time putting bread on the table and paying rent. So the day after my wife delivered our third child, I went to a recruiter.
Wow.
And I thought I wanted to get some technical experience to go with my math degree and then go work for IBM. And that kind of opened the door to my Air Force career.
Wow. So how many years did you spend in the Air Force?
So what was going to be a 4-year tour turned out to be 35 years, 10 months, and 17 days. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for your service.
Oh, it was awesome. It was awesome.
Sure. There's a lot of things I want to talk about in there. I used to, when I was younger, I was convinced I was going to join the Army.
Sure.
And there were different parts in my life where there was like different parts from maybe 19 until 23 where I was very interested in joining. Yeah. And it all culminated with, I was here in Syracuse at, I think, 23 years old, 22. I met with a recruiter. I went and took my ASVAB.
Right.
And the day that I was supposed to go and meet, oh man, I can't remember the sergeant's name now. I was supposed to go meet with the sergeant and sign the paperwork and, all that kind of stuff. He had no call, no showed for that appointment. He had some family emergency, I guess, that happened. And so I showed up at the recruiter office right here on Erie Boulevard, and the captain said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm supposed to," and he said, "Oh, he's not." So he had something come up. He's not here today.
Wow.
And then I just never followed back up with it from there for whatever reason. So, yeah.
But isn't that funny, Anthony, how things happen in life?
For sure.
And then they take you down a different road. And I really do believe that, that there's a master plan, and that's kind of intentional. And it's funny, I said I was going in for 4 years. Well, we had been in about a year, and my wife and I looked at each other and said, oh, my gosh, wow, this is pretty cool. The people we get to meet, the challenges we get to face, the things we'll see that we could have never seen in our lives. So we made a commitment. I said we had 3 children when I went in. We had the fourth the first 2 years while I was in, and we really did soul searching about what it would mean to raise a family in that type of lifestyle. And we can talk about that more later as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so you grew up in Lincourt. I actually live in Lincourt right now. We're on the north side. We live in Hood. But that was the old Italian section of Syracuse. That's where my grandparents were from and grew up.
My mother's side as well.
Okay, yeah. So my grandparents had a store. I don't think it was State Street. It may have been, but my great-grandparents had a store over there, and like sort of a general store. I forget what year it was, but they had come over from Italy and from Sicily, and somehow got here to Syracuse, over to the north side. But that's where my grandparents were born and raised, was over on the north side, and then eventually made their way somehow into Fairmount, to the west side of Syracuse.
Sure.
And that's where my dad grew up and I grew up. So Dad was a graduate of West Hill back in 70.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But my uncle was, manliest military.
Yeah.
And I forget if he wasn't he wasn't the last one, because Uncle Tony would have graduated in 64, something like that, from manliest.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was manliest military school back then, or military academy, whatever it was. But yeah, so they were North Siders, and then here my wife and my son and I, we live back on the North Side now. So not the Italian section anymore, but
very cool. Well, there's a little bit of similarity there. My grandfather immigrated from Italy.
Okay.
And my mom's father, that's my dad's dad, and my mom's father and mother immigrated from Italy.
Okay.
And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a baker at Hotel Syracuse, had his home in Salve, and that's where my dad grew up.
Oh, wow.
So on the west side, too.
That's wild.
Yeah.
A baker inside Hotel Syracuse back then. Man, I wonder what that was like.
Oh, the picture of all the bakers that were on staff, it's amazing.
Really?
Yeah, this is awesome.
We're going to start a food history series based in Syracuse in the winter. And the 4 sort of chapters we're starting with is Syracuse style pizza.
Yeah.
So Twin Trees, but back in the day it started with Shuffles Pizza on the west side.
Right.
And just trying to track that history, because there's so many people. I would wager if you asked 100 people around Syracuse, do you know what Syracuse style pizza is? None of them would know. Maybe 98 percent would say, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right.
So we're going to talk about the history of that, and then one of the other things is just the history of bakeries, because the bakeries in Syracuse.
Well, Lincourt Bakery, right?
Obviously, Lincourt for sure.
Yeah, and now I go to Salt City Bakery often, which is out there in Manlius.
Yeah,
Fayetteville, Manlius.
Very good spot.
Great.
Yeah,
and he's got pictures on the wall of major bakeries throughout the city.
Oh, really?
Columbus, Geddes, etc. Yeah, Lincourt.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, Lincourt I think has the best cannoli in Syracuse. I've did a little tour, and they're my favorite for sure. But Columbus, my grandpa in the 50s, I don't know if it was back to the 40s, but 50s, 60s, 70s, and I think maybe a little bit into the 80s, maybe he was retired by then. He owned a company where if there was a pinball machine, cigarette machine, jukebox, it probably came from him.
Wow, awesome.
And so one thing he used to do is on Sundays, I think it was Saturdays or Sundays, he used to go around and buy just multiple loaves of Columbus bread and then deliver it to friends' houses, in the morning.
Special thing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I remember when he passed years and years ago, that was sort of the thing, is at the service, we had gone and bought like 250 loaves of bread and handed it to everybody who came to the service.
Man, what a neat thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, yeah. All right, so you grow up here, and eventually you join the Air Force. What year were you living back here, and when you retired, did you move back to the area?
Sure, yeah. So I retired in November of 2014.
Okay.
So almost 10 years now. While I was in my last assignment at the Pentagon, I was looking for land in Virginia and North Carolina.
Okay.
And my oldest daughter had gone to Lemoyne, and she and her family were living in Cazenovia.
Gotcha.
And she called me one day, and I remember this very vividly. And she said, "Dad, I think I found your land." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, there's a farm for sale in Cazenovia that's been on the market for a while. This is when real estate was kind of in a little trough. And I just think you ought to take a look at it. So I drove up. It was wintertime, took a look at it. Oh, and they had some motivation, too. They were living in a smaller home on Center Street, and they needed a larger home as their family now had 4 children. And so the property, it's on the historic registry called the Maples, was 90 acres, and it had the estate home on the property, built in 1817. So they were interested in moving into a larger home. I was interested in some land. So we kind of went into a partnership, 50-50 partnership to achieve that. And by the way, I fell in love with the land. And of course, as you kind of suggested, it brought me back to this area, just like you come back to the north side. And so that worked out. So really interesting set of circumstances around that purchase too. As I said, my daughter and son-in-law had a smaller home on Center Street, and so as we were going to go into this deal 50-50, they were trying to come up with their portion of the down payment. So they put a they together said, let's put a contingency on this offer that for 90 days, to allow us to sell our home, and then raise that down payment. So, and that was, as I said, the colder months of the year. Things weren't really selling. They were kind of getting nervous. I said, gosh, don't worry about it. I can cover the down payment. We can get over this hump. We're not worried about that. So about 30 days out, I think it was about 30 days out, the realtor who was representing the property comes to us and says, hey, there's all of a sudden another buyer popped up. They're interested in the property. They want to give you $25,000 to walk away from your offer. And I said, wow, that's pretty cool. But no, we really fell in love. We wanted to go forward, and no, we're going to stick with it. And then, my gosh, it was a week or two later, and this realtor came back to us and said, this other buyer wants to know what it will take for you to walk away from the offer. Wow, my gosh, maybe in hindsight, wow, I don't know. I didn't say anything. I said, no, that's okay. We're gonna press forward, and we did. Well, they don't tell you who that buyer is, but I did find out after the fact, and it was the Maddens. And she is, she is the horsewoman. And so they have another beautiful property up off of 20 now that they developed. And so they were looking for probably something to do similarly in the farm that we ended up buying.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's probably tough to walk away from.
Well, we make decisions like we said, and we go down the road.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. All right, so that was back in 2014. So when did the distillery officially?
Well, that was 2013. We actually ended up closing on the property while it was still active duty.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so before I retired from the Air Force, they said, "What do you want to do when you retire?" I said, "I want to make something in America and create jobs." So that was kind of the strategic vision.
Yeah.
And so after we bought the property, I said to the kids, I want to make it more beautiful than we found it, and I want it self-sustaining. So then I kind of asked them to brainstorm, what can we do here? One of the sons had done some microbrewing at his house, right? And so his kind of first thought was, how about a microbrew? And as you know, there were several breweries popping up, and for a good reason, right? People love beer, and this was, this area had a lot of great breweries in its heyday. And now we have rejuvenated that industry. So we said, well, maybe that's not exactly the right thing to do. So a little more research. And by the way, other things came up. A farm, raise bees for honey. I mean, and I love when people just kind of freewheel and brainstorm, right? Yeah. So then the thought came up, well, how about a artisan distillery, making small batch spirits. And quite frankly, I had no information about that. I had no background in that. So I asked some more questions, and we thought, gosh, that might be fun. I think I mentioned this to you before, Anthony. I had one reservation, and that is that I really do things with wounded warriors. And you and I had a moment to chat before this pod session began about our veterans and about the sacrifices they make. And so sometimes I did things with wounded warriors. And when I say I did things, I mean I visited them. Mm-hmm. I listened to their stories, at Walter Reed Medical Center in D.C., at Brooks Army Medical Center in San Antonio. And the time, shortly before I retired is when, there was a high point in all the injuries and losses we were sustaining in the Middle East. So I had, and it was just all moving experiences. Well, to get to the point I was going to make, I was a little hesitant about producing spirits because wounded warriors, some veterans, some of us just having hard times in life can oftentimes use alcohol to self-medicate.
For sure.
And I didn't want to encourage that. So as I said, I did a little more investigation. And you know what? I said that we have this farm, and really, when you talk about spirits, it begins with the earth and growing grains. And, so that part of it I found really attractive. And the farm had been fallow for many years, so we partnered with an organic farmer in the area, and so we started to develop some of our fields. Now, let me just tell you, the farm in its heyday of 90 acres probably would have been a pretty big farm. Today, it's not.
Yeah.
So, they can't produce and use the equipment that they use today on some of the smaller fields. So we're using it as smartly as we can. But again, it starts with Mother Earth, and then lots of manual labor before you get to taking a drink from anything. And the other thing I do in order to continue that theme of not glamorizing alcohol, I don't call our bar area a bar. It is a tasting room. Now, it doesn't mean we don't offer special cocktails and spirits, but it is a tasting room, and I want it to be that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's kind of that approach almost reminds me a little bit of like the whole world of THC right now, especially here in New York State. And there are very, very, very specific things you can and cannot say, when it comes to THC and hemp-derived products and Delta-9 and all that kind of stuff. So, that kind of interesting way of calling it a tasting room instead of a bar reminds me of that a little bit. It's, I've been out there and, a couple times. And you're right. It doesn't feel like a typical sort of a distillery bar sort of a setting. It feels a little bit more like, kind of like a farm, sort of a casual restaurant almost.
Great.
The business, having some sort of a agro-tourism business in this neck of the woods of New York is, I would, from having worked with a couple clients who are in that space, I would say is like one of the most attractive food-based businesses to be in here in upstate New York.
It really is.
Because you can bring so many people in just from the fact of like where it is and the property, and especially the gorgeous building out there, and not have to just rely on your food or your alcohol in order to bring them in, so.
You have it exactly right. I say this, I say a couple of things. One of the things I say is, man, I am the worst businessman in the world, for crying out loud. I say, come out, sit on an Adirondack chair, listen to the music, drink water, watch the sunset. People love the farm. People love the property. People love, it's kind of funny, Anthony. I had 27 addresses before I bought my first home, and that was in Cazenovia. So you could walk into a place, just like any business, right? And you can feel the energy, whether it's positive or negative.
Yeah.
So I want people to walk in and say, my gosh, I get a good vibe here. I could sit down and maybe have a beer, maybe have a Coke, but enjoy some time with a friend or a family member and just chill.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the feedback we get, and I really love that feedback.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go back a little bit to when you grew up.
Sure.
What was Central New York and Syracuse like back then?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, it was a wonderful place to grow up and a great environment for blue-collar, middle-class folks and the jobs that were available. That's kind of what my dad did. I mentioned he grew up in Solvay, but there were several plants along that Onondaga River or Onondaga Lake there I mean, he worked in some of them.
Yeah.
I eventually became self-employed, and maybe that's where I got the spirit from. You mentioned some of those pizza parlors. Gosh, I can remember after basketball games on a Friday night, going down to North Salina Street and go to the Villa and others and having some of those wonderful pizzas. We talk about this, and certainly the city was vibrant, but I'm happy to see that there's some rejuvenation going on downtown, and that's great. We hear about this. And I try to temper it a little bit. My gosh, things were great. Well, yeah. I mean, there are some things that were different. I'll give you an example I was talking to somebody about the other day. I drive down the street today, and there's a couple of folks, great volunteers, that help the kids cross the street. Well, when I was in grammar school, I became a patrol boy. So, they gave you a belt, they gave you a badge, you had a post. That's pretty cool, Yeah. You got to wear a badge like that, and we spent a lot of time outside in not far from where I grew up is Woodlawn Cemetery.
Okay.
And Woodlawn Cemetery had some great fields out there where they weren't in use yet.
Yeah.
So we'd play baseball and football and do that. And grew up fishing and going to Oneida Lake, and it was a great place to grow up. And even the little Lynchburg community, people talk about that as a nice place to raise a family. You mentioned your grandparents. My grandmother had fields in the area that some of her children built homes on.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's where I am, right, or my mom's house is right now. She passed away last year, but she was still in the house she sent me off to kindergarten in.
Wow.
And, that's kind of unheard of, right?
Yeah.
And now my sister bought the house, so we're glad that the homestead stays in the family.
Yeah. It's amazing how much, I'm 38, and my parents still live in the house that my grandfather built back in 54.
Right.
And, it's amazing how, as I get older, how important those, those like legacies are.
Yeah.
Even like our son is going to be 2 years old in just over a month. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is like, man, like who's going to keep the family name going? Who's going to keep these stories going? And so I'm the fourth Anthony Tringale, not the fourth, but I'm the fourth one to hold that name.
Yeah.
Our son is the fifth. And I just think about like, okay, in 30 years, hopefully he's married and has a son and names him Anthony Tringale to keep that name going. But we have, we're doing a podcast, my siblings and I, I'm one of four. We're recording a podcast with my father at Thanksgiving where it's going to be the five of us, the four kids and my dad, and we're going to sit down here and go just ask him all those family stories.
Super.
What was it like growing up, and
Super.
all those things he remembers, so that way we can keep that, those stories alive for the family. It's amazing as I've gotten older how much I've like really been so interested in those things.
I appreciate that.
And not just for the family, but even just for our area in general.
Oh, man, Anthony, that's awesome. Listen, when my grandfather came over from Italy, he was a young boy. He came with his brother. And I don't know what, they came through Ellis Island.
Yeah.
I really don't know what the stimulus was behind that. But his brother returned home. My grandfather was, I think he was 10 years old.
Wow.
But there were some friends over here from Italy that took him in. When he arrived, my grandfather would pronounce our last name Basla.
Okay.
He was from northern Italy, Piemonte. And my father kind of Americanized that to Basla. But nonetheless, the spelling didn't change as some of the Italian names had. When he arrived, he was the only Basla in the country.
Wow.
And he had one son. I mean, I'm getting at your point here. My dad had, he had 4 sons. Of those, I had one son. And I mean, these are, and my brother Mark has one son. My brother Joe has 2 sons, and my brother Pete has 1 son.
Okay.
So I took a picture with my grandfather, my father, me, and Adam, my son.
Yeah.
So we had 4 generations represented.
That's cool.
It is very cool. Now, I did hear that, and I got a letter from a lawyer from South America who was a Basla.
Oh, wow.
So, some of them went to South.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Italians went down to South, Argentina,
Right.
and a lot of different places.
Exactly.
It's so funny. We have our last name's Tringale.
Yeah.
It was Tringali, spelled with
Sure.
an I, and I think I don't know if it was my grandfather or his dad that changed it to the E to make it more American. But there's another Tringale family in Syracuse, in the area with from what we can tell, no relation.
Huh.
They have, and they were in the music business. They own like piano stores and whatnot. And actually it's funny. My father is Robert Joseph Tringale. There's another Robert Joseph Tringale in grew up in like North Syracuse.
Wow.
But no family connection or
Very
relation
cool.
whatsoever.
Very cool.
It's very, very weird.
It's very weird too.
Because there's other Tringales out there in the world. I've especially recently typing in Anthony Tringale. It's funny how many of them popped up around the country. But it is interesting that in the same city, but no family relation.
And I really love what you said about now your interest being piqued about understanding some of the history, some of the legacy, some of our roots.
Yeah.
And sometimes this happens to us. Now you're a father with a son, and you're thinking about that. Tradition, legacy, passing on, customs and courtesies. Mm-hmm. So that's very, very, very cool. And another thing, reason that I came back here was to reconnect with the family. My mom was one of 12.
Wow.
And so I got a bunch of cousins, and in fact, we had a surprise birthday party for my oldest daughter Saturday, and I just opened it up to both sides of the family. Come on, so we could get together. I'm reading a book right now. My wife and I did a couple of nights at a bed and breakfast in the Catskills recently, and they had a couple of just random books on the nightstand. One was an investment book from the 90s, and one was a book written by President Eisenhower. It's called Mandate for Change. It's about his years as president. And so I just picked up the book, read 2 pages, and when we came home, I told my wife, I want that book. She went online. She found me a used copy. So I'm reading that. So that history fascinated me, too. It starts when he was still General Eisenhower.
Okay. Wow.
Then what led to them encouraging him to run for president, and then all the challenges he faced, all the decisions that were made, the similarities between then and now, and how some of those decisions carried forward, and some we took a different direction. So I'm fascinated as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's amazing how many things in the past have influenced things. Today, it's like there's not too much has changed. A lot's changed, but not too much has changed.
Right.
It's very interesting. One of my things that fascinates me about Syracuse, especially restaurant and food history, is traveling all over the state this year, especially. There's other cities that have. You ask almost anybody that lives there, that grew up there, and they know their restaurant and food history to a T. You go to Rochester, you know who the first garbage plate was.
Yeah.
You're in Buffalo. Yeah. You know the story of chicken wings and beef on weck and all these different things. And you know who the oldest are and all that kind of stuff. Especially in New York City, everybody knows that stuff. And in Syracuse, again, it's not that well known. So that's part of like. It's a little curiosity and, just self-interest in kind of preserving those things,
Well, it's also a service. It's a service to all of us, and the people that live here, to know that history and appreciate it, because doggone it, we had our share and still do of great restaurants.
For sure.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So, how, from your son-in-law with, microbrewing into, what are we going to do with the farm?
Right.
What was the jump into, making liquor and then choosing, because the first product was gin, is that right?
Yeah.
So
no, the first product was vodka.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, it was vodka. Yeah.
Okay. So walk me through that
Sure.
process.
So, I said, okay, I got to the point where, this artisan spirit small batch distillery, that sounds fascinating to me. And so, we did a business plan, although, it's kind of interesting. I was a public service servant for all my life. So, learning this new entrepreneurship was fascinating and certainly a heck of a steep learning curve. But we put a business plan together. We were able to secure some funds from Farm Credit East, because agribusiness, as you kind of mentioned a little bit ago, we're a farm distillery. We have 2 licenses, and one of them is as a farm distillery, which kind of dictates that a lot of our materials comes from New York State, which I'm totally for on that. Again, rejuvenating the whole state and in particular our central New York area. We then researched, well, where do you find the best distilling equipment in the world? And we came to the answer, there are 2. The one we chose is Carl's Manufacturer from Eislingen, Germany.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I happen to have my son, who I mentioned earlier, was working over there in Germany. He and his family were over there. So we did a family trip over there, and we went and paid a visit to Alexander Planck. Alexander and his brother are 5th generation making this equipment and shipping it around the world.
Wow.
It was very cool. In fact, there's a picture in our tasting room of my son-in-law, my son, and I standing in front of our still pot as it was under construction. and so we met with Alexander. We closed the deal. He continued to complete our still, which you've seen, and it's a beautiful piece of work.
Yeah.
It looks like an art piece.
It really does.
And what we learned when we went over there, we didn't know beforehand, is that each year they come over and do a distilling workshop at Cornell. We found that fascinating and kind of neat that there was even a local connection.
Yeah.
So we brought the equipment over, or they shipped it over, I should say. And then we had some help from HVAC specialist who assembled the equipment. Alexander has a representative in Pennsylvania who came up and kind of said, man, you guys didn't do too badly here. We talked to people in the industry, so we did our homework about how you actually distill spirits. We got smart on that. We made a choice to go with organic grains. We think that's important. Again, going back to Mother Earth and letting her produce the finest, in nature's way. We are blessed to have Marcellus Shale spring water on the farm. Again, wow. Happenstance maybe, but working out, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Marcellus Shale spring water provides some minerals into the spirits that adds to the flavor profile. So that was very special. The building, and you mentioned the beautiful distillery that we've constructed, it's all new construction, started as a Barn Pro horse barn kit. So the size kind of fit our needs. We modified the footprint a little bit for what part we wanted public access and what we wanted to do our production area in. That went up. I was still working in D.C. At the time. After I retired, I went to work in defense contracting as an advisor for a while, and in the defense industry, I should say. And I'd come up here periodically to New York as construction phase was going on. I'd stand in the middle of that. I'd look up this beautiful, the timber that's going up, and I said, "My gosh, this is just like a big kid's fort," and that's what I think it is. We had a 200-year-old barn on the farm that fell, so we were able to reclaim a lot of that wood. We've got raw edge in there. We've got beams that are used as footrests right now, and we just love the construction. And we also have a second floor. That's kind of the main tasting room area. We have a second floor that was actually reinforced to be storage for hay hay bales.
Oh, okay.
So now, we've got this big, beautiful area up there. I wanted it to be a little different vibe, if you will. It's used for private events, and people love that.
Yeah.
We've got some great windows that look over the farm, and we've continued to expand the footprint, if you will, by adding a patio area. Last year, I had a 40 by 80 pole barn built, which stores our farm equipment and barrels and bottles and such. Me and my buddy, who I was at Grimes with, we built a stage out there.
Oh, yeah.
So now we've got some music happening. And as far as the spirits are concerned, we started with vodka, as I mentioned a moment ago. So vodka starts as what's called a grain-neutral spirit, right? And you can use different grains.
Yeah.
In our case, we happen to use organic corn.
Okay.
We're getting it from this farmer we partnered with that I mentioned a moment ago. I didn't mention his name, but it's the GM Fortes. Okay. The dad is Pete. The son is Luke. Luke, in fact, went to Cornell himself, as did his wife. Yeah. So we buy our organic corn from them. We had to figure out how should we, how much did we want to break this corn down so we could maximize the sugar content. So it actually looks like a cornmeal now after he grates it for us. We bring it back. We've got a 800-gallon mash tun that we bought, again, locally from JBF Steel.
Okay.
And we start to cook the corn, go through the whole distilling process. It's very fascinating when we have guests there and we walk them through it because folks really don't know a lot about that.
Right.
But here's the difference between small batch and the major manufacturer of spirits. There's no computer running this. Everything is through our taking temperatures, are using hydrometers, are doing smell tests, are doing taste tests. So we cook that corn. When we get it to where we think, this is about as good as we're going to get it, then we add sugar to that. We do some crash cooling to that. We add the yeast, and we found out what the best yeast and also nutrients for the yeast to maximize their efforts. And folks, if you don't know this, the yeast will eat the sugar that process created, and the byproduct will be CO2 gas and alcohol.
Yeah.
And then we'll take that wash, move it over to our still pot, and please come out and see it if you haven't, or look online to Madison County Distillery. You'll see some beautiful photos of it. And then we do what's called a stripping run. And that stripping run is merely stripping the water and the corn away from that alcohol. And we capture that. And as you do this, you're using different components of the still pot and the towers that are associated with it, and the vaporizers and the condensers, etc. After that first step is done, we come away with what's called low wine. The low wine is probably about 30% to 35% alcohol. And then we run that through another run, which is called the spirit run. And by the time we get that spirit run out, we're getting about 95, 96% pure alcohol. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's clean, and that's what you want for your grain-neutral spirits. You want it clean, odorless, tasteless, right?
Yeah.
And so then we go through the next step of we store that in some stainless steel tanks. It's not aging, but it is mellowing. And we store it at 60% alcohol. How do you go from 95%, Mike, to 60% alcohol? Well, you add some more of that Marcellus Shale spring water, and then you check it with your hydrometer. And then, I'm kind of going through the nuts and bolts of this, Anthony.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I don't want to bore anybody out there. And then we finally cut it after about 2 months to 40% by adding more water, and then we'll bottle that for our Stone Quarry vodka.
Okay.
It was the first product because that really was the most logical sequence to put that vodka out. That's how you make vodka without infusing it with any flavors. We call it Stone Quarry vodka because I mentioned that our farm, the Maples Farm, is on the historic registry. Well, adjacent to the farm was a stone quarry. And adjacent to the farm is Stone Quarry Road. And so it was just like you like this history. We want to maintain those connections to the past as well.
Yeah.
To go from there to gin, if you'd like me to talk to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it the same proof? Is the gin the same proof as the vodka?
It is not. It is 45.
Okay.
45. So I'm a gin drinker. I started many years ago. I started with Tanqueray. I went to Bombay Sapphire. I went to Hendrick's. If you're gin drinkers out there, you know all these labels. The last gin I was drinking is called The Botanist. And it was really from a botanist out in Scotland who developed his flavor profile. So how do you go from grain neutral spirit to gin? You go through some of those same steps that I just mentioned, and then you add botanicals. And that's a process. So if you go online, I mentioned Tanqueray earlier. If you go online and look up Tanqueray, you could find out which botanicals they've added to that grain neutral spirit to create their flavor profile. But what they don't tell you is what percentage of each of those botanicals are included. So that takes some experimentation.
Yeah.
All gins are going to have about 50% juniper berries because that's kind of a basic botanical that's added. But after that, you can use your imagination. And if you go to a liquor store, if you will, you'll see some kind of highlight. This is lavender-infused gin, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So ours, we've taken some licorice, we've taken some orange and lemon peel, we've taken some coriander. So we've added different things, and we've come up with the flavor profile that I really like. Now, I've taken some liberty when we named that. We call it General's Gin because I'm a gin drinker, and I was blessed to retire as a Lieutenant General out of the Air Force. We then went to a third product line. We have bottled and we've aged and bottled rum. And I was told that there weren't any real distillers in New York State making rum. We went to, now here's where we had to buy some material outside of New York. We went to Columbia to buy Panela. Panela is sugarcane that's squeezed, boiled, and crystallized until you get a sugar that came from the sugarcane. Rum is made from molasses or sugarcane, and this really is going back to the original rum.
Yeah.
So we've used that Panela. We made rum. We've completed 2 batches thus far. We aged the rum in white oak barrels that we bought from 80K Cooperage, which is in Remsen, New York.
Yeah.
Joe and his team up there do a fantastic job. And if you want to watch a cool video, go to 80K Cooperage on YouTube and watch how they make those barrels.
Oh, that's cool.
That's a very cool thing. And that's another lost art that Joe learned from a Cooper out west. So we aged that rum, and right now batch 2 is sold out. But it was very cool. I called it Brum because it really tastes like bourbon too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with that white oak aging. And the other thing interesting for the folks on the net that are listening, you always get asked, how long did you age it for? Well, the aging time is associated with the size of your barrel.
Yeah.
The smaller the barrel, actually, the shorter your time frame can be because that alcohol has more exposure to the charring that's occurred inside the barrel.
Yeah.
In the case of our rum, we were aging it in 10-gallon barrels, and we were doing it for about 18 months. We're in the process now of doing our 3rd batch of rum, which we call, by the way, Route 20 rum. And I want to tell you about how we got that label in a moment. And I think we're going to bottle some of that clear as well, because that will just speed the process. We'll get some rum out that we can mix with our cocktails, or people can purchase wholesale or retail, and then we'll age some as well. Let me tell you how we got the label for rum. Labeling is kind of an interesting thing. You want your product to stand out on a shelf. And we were told when we got into this process that will change over time as we have greater insight into what our product represents, what our branding is all about.
Yeah.
And you certainly know that. We have had about 3 iterations of our Stone Quarry vodka, and now I think we've got a label that we like very much. It highlights the Marcellus Shale spring water. On the back, we have our story about, which I'm sharing with you now. Similar with the General's Gin, we've kind of this is our second, I think, label on that. We have a story about me being a gin drinker on the back of that. Route 20 rum. We talk about the history of rum in New York State. There was some rum running during Prohibition across Lake Ontario and Canada. So that occurred. But for that label, it's a long process and actually kind of an expensive process to develop a label. If you hire someone to come up with some ideas and do some prototypes, etc. Well, we decided, and I forget how we found out about this, to put this out on the net. And we made it global. So we said we want to develop a label for our rum product. We decided it was a contest that the name of the rum would be Route 20 rum. We want these kinds of things covered in that label. We just turned it out into the wild. Within a week, we had people from around the world banging on that request.
Wow.
We would provide feedback. Within 2 weeks, we settled on one of those, selected that artist, provided them with a check, and we're off and running.
Wow.
Yeah. And we don't have, by the way, we'll put a call out on this. We don't have a name for our bourbon yet, and I was going to mention that. I mentioned to Anthony when I came in that we have some bourbon in barrels, and we're looking at having our first breakout of that first barrel, in March of 2025.
Okay.
So we need to come up with a name for that. We need to come up with a label for that.
Is that another small barrel, or is that a normal, like a 50-gallon?
It is not a 55-gallon. It's a 30-gallon. Okay. So we've got 30-gallon barrels now that we're using, and we are graduating into the 55. Gotcha. And as I mentioned earlier, the bigger the barrel, the longer the aging process. So we wanted to get something out there a little quicker.
Yeah.
And then once you get this rolling, and people are asking for bourbon, once you get this rolling, then you'll have product that you can continue to put out. What you don't want to do is raise someone's expectations and disappoint them.
For sure. Yeah, especially in the world of bourbon, there's so much out there, especially like on the national level, that they buy their fluid from whoever it is, and then just age it themselves.
Right.
Just to sort of
speed the growth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you as somebody who 2 or 3 years ago, I was starting to get into bourbon collecting, and I won't even call it collecting, because all I was really buying was the typical stuff that everybody's buying. Sure. The Stags and Blantons and all that. And after about a year of trying to hunt through and find different bottles, and I've had Nick Pascal on the podcast like 4 times.
Wow, cool.
Just to talk about, a couple of times just to talk about bourbon and then just other stuff. But so, I was falling victim for the same allocated stuff like everyone was. My first real foray into it was I bought a Russell's Reserve 13, which is a really hard bottle to find.
Yes.
And
yes,
but I had heard about the secondary market. And so I bought this bottle for $100, and I immediately went home and thought, I'm going to go try and find out how to sell this, because on the secondary market, it was like a $700 bottle.
Yeah.
And I go home with this bottle, and I Google how to sell a bottle of bourbon. And the first thing I find is it's federally illegal to sell a bottle of bourbon. And so I thought, well, never mind, I can't do that. So I bought that maybe a month before my son was born. So I've just decided I'm going to keep it unopened, and when he's older, he'll get that bottle.
Oh, that's great.
But for about a year, I was just kind of falling victim to oh man, I've been looking for whatever the bottle is, Blanton's, whatever the case. And about Christmas time after that first year, I had this like realization, like there's nowhere else in life where I think to myself, man, I really want the sought after thing is the mass produced item. Right.
Yeah.
It's always, what's the small batch, what's the rare, whatever the case is. And so why am I going after the mass produced bourbon as sort of the crown jewel of what I want to waste my money on? Especially when it just sits on a shelf and I don't really sit there and enjoy it. Yeah. So then I started kind of looking into, the local, especially the New York State people that were making spirits and bourbons and stuff, and trying to spend money with their stuff.
That's cool. Thank you.
And then I stopped drinking as much, so now it just sits there and waits for me to make a video.
Well, let me piggyback on your point, because I think it's great for your audience to hear. And I'll use our Stone Quarry vodka as an example. If people are going to go to a liquor store or going to go to a restaurant or a bar, they are going to order what they know about and what they normally drink.
Yeah.
And so I get that. So so as a small batch, it's a challenge for me to get our brand out there and get people to sample it. I took our Stone Quarry vodka. I said I was working in the D.C. area after I retired. I took our Stone Quarry vodka down to Northern Virginia, and I had blind taste tests. I had blind taste tests with our Stone Quarry vodka, Kettle One, Tito's, and Grey Goose, and another small batch distillery. And I didn't tell the samplers which was which. And I had them, actually I had a little score sheet, and I had them taste and give me feedback. Well, our Stone Quarry vodka won every time. And in fact, one of the guys that was in this blind taste test was actually from Russia. So, and he knew vodkas. He knew them upside and down.
Yeah.
So he also picked ours and really gave it high marks. So and recently, we entered our gin and vodka recently this past April in New York International Spirit Competition. There were 1,400 entries from 39 countries.
Wow.
Both our gin and vodka took home silver medals.
Wow.
We were just thrilled.
That's amazing.
Yeah, no, we were thrilled. And so, I'd ask folks, when you go to a liquor store, when you go to a bar, think about local products, small batch, give them a try, give them a taste. Even, as you're talking about, Anthony, buy some of those small batch bourbons, have a little blind taste with yourself or with some friends, and see what happens. See what, oh my gosh, there is a difference. Oh, I do like this. I'm really not crazy about that. And
That's cool.
we'll learn a lot that way. And the other thing I say, most people don't drink their spirits straight. Now, bourbon is a little different. But if you're talking about vodka and gin and rum, you're usually mixing it with something.
Yeah.
So if you taste it straight, that's different than if you're going to mix it with something. So,
For sure. Yeah. I've actually later today, I've got a gentleman. So we're hosting a cocktail competition tomorrow night.
Oh,
He
neat.
Local is down at Three Lives in downtown. And there's a guy coming in later today. His name's Richard. He grew up here in Syracuse, went to Liverpool, since moved to Los Angeles. But a friend of his, and he at the time, I forget how many years ago, decided that they wanted to look into starting their own liquor brand. And so they went to Mexico and spent months going around to all these different, farms down there essentially. And they wound up finding a Mescalero that they really liked his product. And so they started, now they have their own Mezcal brand. And it's called Dos Cabachos. And they're based in LA, but they, sell all over the place. but then they're the sponsor for tomorrow's cocktail competition, so we flew in for it. But it's really interesting to hear their process of, finding the product that they liked, but then also the thinking through the logistics of it's in Mexico. How the heck do they get it into the States and, all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty interesting.
I think I met Richard. I think he's been to our distillery. I'm gonna,
Oh, really?
I'm going to try to come down tomorrow. I've got another commitment, but
Yeah. It's tomorrow night at 7.
Okay, great.
So they're really cool guys, but it's just interesting that, the logistics of it. It's great when I saw that you all were producing rum, because I used to run a bar that had a farm license, and it's impossible to find certain products for a bar when you have a farm license.
Right. Tough.
So, and there's not many companies. I only know of maybe 2 in New York State who make a farm-based rum.
Yeah.
So it's, that's definitely a need for those, especially in the brewery world.
Great.
So many of them that have farm licenses still, so they can't buy, regular products.
Yeah.
So to have a rum like that is, really great. All right. So when you were in the Air Force, what was your MOS?
Oh, great. Okay, you are Army. In the Air Force, it's AFSC.
Is it AFSC? Okay.
Well, that's Air Force Specialty Code.
Okay, gotcha.
And the Army, it's MOS. And so the neat thing about that is your services are, we're now, there's a lot of us that are joint warfighters.
Okay.
Which means that, the land, sea, and air just work together so great, closely that we become joint. Anyway, so my specialty, it's interesting. I told you I wanted to do 4 years of technical work and then get out and go work, and I thought IBM at the time. So I went into communications. That was my specialty for the longest period of time. Well, in the Air Force, just as it happened in the world and certainly started in our country, there was a morphing of that world. So you got the merging with computers.
Yeah.
You got the merging with information. You got the merging with intelligence, right? And so as my career continued, I took on computers. I took on command and control. I took on, more recently, cyberspace and space. So when I retired, I was a senior cyberspace operator in the Air Force. And at one point, I was the vice commander of Space Command, Air Force Space Command, which the guy that was the first commander of Space Force was working for me out there.
Oh, wow.
So that was a great guy, you know. And so, so those are the things that I kind of sunk my teeth into. And it's interesting because if you tell someone that you were in the Air Force, or if you really say you're a general in the Air Force, well, what did you fly? That's kind of the first question. So I have to tell them that, well, I really didn't fly. But I also am proud to say that there are, if you will, 3 warfighting specialties in the Air Force: air, space, and cyberspace.
Yeah.
And I was involved in 2 of them. And as we talk about how the world changed, we see how cyber and space are becoming more and more important in the first purpose of our military is to prevent war. That's the first, preserve peace, right? So space and cyberspace, I mean, you're doing a lot of monitoring of what's going around the world, what's happening out there, and hopefully we can preclude having to actually get involved in wars where weapons are used.
Yeah, I mean, the Air Force shifted quite a bit into, the world of cybersecurity. I mean, I can remember, I remember those shift in commercials when I was younger.
Sure.
And seeing so much of that.
Sure.
So my brother Robert is currently a federal agent with the FBI, and he desperately wanted to be an officer in the Marines, and so. He had gone out for officer candidate school once or twice, and was always just short of making the cut. And so then he transitioned to to the FBI, and he's been with the Bureau, I think, now for 10 or 11 years.
Awesome.
And now he's on the SWAT team in Cincinnati. He was in New York City for a bit as counterterrorism surveillance.
Wow.
And so I would talk to my brother, which it's always weird when it's like a family member, but I would talk to my brother and I'd be like, what are you doing? I'd be like, I'm following this guy around the city right now.
Wow.
It's just
very cool.
It's weird when it's a family member. It seems like a joke, so to speak. But then they moved to Cincinnati and he was on the SWAT team. But yeah, it's always so interesting how real things get when you have family that's involved in it, you know?
Yeah.
Like I said, being in Killeen, Texas, and you know, Fort Hood's right there, and so many people in our church that were you know, in the Army, in the military there, and you know, the reality of the sacrifice that, you know, them and their families have to make. It's just absolutely crazy. I'll never forget this one time. I was flying from Killeen. I forget where I was going, but I was flying. I was connecting through Atlanta. There was Killeen is a small airport, and so all of the planes that fly out of there are tiny, and you know, where you can see the entire plane, and you know, I don't know, maybe they sat 50 people, let's say. It's where the ticket agent is also your TSA agent, right? So that's sort of a thing. So we were on this flight to Atlanta, and there was this large group of German military members that were on the flight to Atlanta. And at the time, I was a smoker, and so when we got to Atlanta, I don't know if they still do, but when we got to the Atlanta airport, I had a couple hours of a layover, and I went and found their smoking lounge that they had inside, which just so happened was in the international terminal. Mm-hmm. And so when I got in there, that same group of men were in there smoking. And so I wound up sitting down and talking with one of them, and it turned out they were like German special forces who had been at Fort Hood doing some sort of joint training for some time. And I got to sit there and have this conversation with this guy for about an hour and a half about what it was like to be a member of German military, especially in a country, you know, coming off of, you know, I mean, obviously it's so many years removed, but, you know, just thinking through what's that like to be German military with Germany's history of, you know, the Nazi Party and, you know, the 2 world wars. And it was really, really interesting to sit there and have this conversation with the guy and just hear his perspective and, you know, the German people's perspective on military and force and all that kind of stuff. It was a great experience.
Yeah, I love that you're a curious guy and you engage with folks. And, you know, let me piggyback on that and say this. You said it's from your story about your brother Robert. It's different when it's a family member. The fact of the matter is there are less and less families in this nation that have any family member that's in the military service. So what that does and what we don't want to happen is have a disconnect between our military and our nation. The people that are, you know, putting us out there to do their bidding, you know, to protect our freedom. So if you get a chance to meet a military member or an FBI agent or whatever, please sit down and have that conversation. And say, you know, what do? You know, how is it on your family? One of my daughters went to 3 different high schools.
Wow.
You know, so those are kind of tough things, and those are sacrifices. I miss my son's high school graduation. I mean, there's so many examples. But look, these are minor. But I'm saying, ask them, talk to them. Because they aren't going to just volunteer this information. You know, you got to really sit down and create a safe environment for them, and they'll share some of that story. So I appreciate what you did, Robert. I really do. I say, you know, can I give a vignette about a wounded warrior?
Yeah, please.
Because I think it kind of epitomizes their spirit and their courage. I was at Walter Reed with my executive officer. She was a major space officer. I was at Space Command at the time, as I mentioned. We walked into a room, we walked into several rooms, but the one room that I'm going to talk about was Specialist Gadsden, Army guy. And Gadsden was laying on his bed, his hospital bed, his wife, Maria, was at the foot of his bed, kind of putting her hand on his good foot, and his left leg looked like a piece of meat that would have been on my father's butcher block, because my dad was self-employed. He got a little grocery store. Anyway, so I says, Gadsden, what happened to you? And he said, it's the damnedest thing, sir. He says, I was on patrol. I had a couple guys with me. He says, we're going over this wire. He says, I put over my right foot. I put over my left foot. I hear a click. I say, oh, shit. He said, the next thing I know, I wake up in Wiesbaden, Germany. Wiesbaden is where one of the medical centers is that, a staging area to give some triage before a wounded warrior is brought home. So I says, well, Gadsden, what are you going to do next? He says, well, I'm going to get out of this bed and I'm going to get back in the fight. Well, what if they don't let you back in the fight? Well, I'm going to get out of this bed. I'm going to walk down the hall. I'm going to talk to all my buddies, say they got to get out of their beds and they got to get back in the fight if they can. I thought, wow, that is pretty awesome. So I leave. I go to another room, and my exec, she stays behind. And then we meet out. We're both in uniform. Then we meet outside. And so I said, so how was it? Well, I talked to Gadsden a little bit longer. I said, well, what happened? And she says, well, he asked me, what do I do in the Air Force? And she says, I'm a space officer. Really? He says, you ever been over in the AOR, the area of responsibility, where we're fighting? She said, yeah, I was over there. She said, I hope I go back again. He says, well, what do you do over there? She says, well, we want to find the IEDs that took your leg out. Oh, really? You're going to go back? She says, I hope so. He says, well, if you go back, will you look for my left leg? She says, what? And she says, yeah. He says, it may or may still have a boot on it. The hair is probably burned off, and it's black. And at that point, Lynn fell into my arms crying. And, that's the kind of spirit these guys have. And I could go on and tell you more stories, but I'll just share that one. And I appreciate what you said, Robert. And I ask the men and women that are that listen to your podcast that go out there and find somebody to serve, say thank you. And that always happens. Thank you always happens. But go another step and really see if, every one of us has our life story. Share something about yourself and let that person share something about themselves with you.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I think that's a great way to end this podcast. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. Thank you for your service. And everybody who's listening, if you haven't been, get out to Madison County Distillery.
Thank you.
Check them out.
Please do.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Anthony. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Take care.